2 more people, and we'll be at 100, and then I'll get started. Fantastic. We're at 100 people, so that's about a good moment to start. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. And welcome, firstly, to this session of the WTO's 2021 Public Forum, organised by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the IISD. It's entitled Building Bridges, Border Carbon Adjustment and the Multilateral Trading System. So a warm welcome to those of you who are following us online, and a welcome also for those of you who are following us from the WTO's premises. My name's Alice Tipping, and I lead work on a number of trade policy issues at the IISD. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of global experts on the topic of border carbon adjustments. I'll introduce them in just a second, but first, the important question, why are we here? It's clear, at least to us, that as countries ramp up the ambition of their climate policy, they are also considering measures to guard against leakage in energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. What this session aims to do is to explore whether and how these measures can be taken in a way that reduces trade tensions and respects a number of core principles in international relations. So the principle of special differential treatment while achieving climate policy objectives. So we'll be asking what's driving growth in the interest in border carbon adjustments, how are these policies being implemented, what have the reactions been, and what are some of the prospects for achieving a degree of international consensus or common ground around principles or best practices at least, and where might discussions about the possibility of that start to take place. So again, I'm delighted to have with us to help walk through these questions a panel of world-leading thinkers on this topic. They reflect perspectives from both developed and developing countries. And I'm hoping that their initial interventions are going to provoke an active debate amongst them and also an active debate with you, our audience today. We're going to hear first from Susanna Droege, who is Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And we've asked her to help us understand essentially sort of the state of play within the EU's BCA proposal and the extent perhaps to which that proposal might be influenced by the views of others. Why the EU specifically, I hear you ask? Essentially because it's the clearest, probably most detailed example we have at this point of what a BCA might look like. So the question for us really is kind of, well, where is the first mover in this space? We'll hear then from Arunama Ghosh, who's the Chief Executive Officer for the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India, who will help us understand a bit how the EU's proposal has been received, but also looking more broadly, what the extent of possible common ground on this issue could be. Is there any sort of international agreement or common ground about BCAs that could be achieved or that could achieve some buy-in from export-oriented developing countries? He'll be followed by Lu Shankun, the Managing Director of LADECO in Geneva. So following on this theme of sort of possible international cooperation a bit further, where might it be pursued? What are policymakers' options? And then we'll come at last to my own colleague, Aaron Crosby, who's Senior Associate at IISD and one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of trade and climate change, who'll help us understand a little bit what this common ground might look like. There's some thinking on the topic already. So I'm going to give each of the speakers 5 minutes for a quick scene setting sort of intervention, and then I'll come back to each of them for short reactions to what they've heard their colleagues say. And then I'll bring in questions and answers from the audience. So do please put your Q&A in the public forum's Q&A box, which I can see, and I'll be able to weave those into the discussion as we go along, and in particular at the end. So with those first short words of introduction, I'm delighted to give you the floor first, Susanna, for a quick introduction to where the EU's thinking is at on this, as you understand it. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Alice, and hello to everyone in this room. Yeah, I'll start right away, and Alice, please give me the 1 minute signal if I am overdrawing my time. As you may all be aware of, on the 14th of July, the EU launched a big package, a big chunk of its Fit for 55 package, which is aiming at a delivery to the Paris Agreement commitments by the EU. And part of this package is a new legislative proposal on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Alice used border carbon adjustment, BCA, as a short, as an abbreviation, and the invention of the European Commission is the so-called CBAM, which is a way to interpret border carbon adjustments. And it's meant to be a mechanism for imports, charging imports that enter the EU for specific sectors. We can go into details of this draft later, but where does the debate stand? Well, after this presentation of the largest chunk of the package with 13 initiatives, 8 reform proposals, now this goes into the parliamentary processes. So the European Parliament has established its kind of division of labor, who is in charge of looking into which proposal, and the Environmental Committee and a rapporteur were chosen to discuss the details of the proposal by the Commission. While one has to be aware of the fact that the European Parliament itself has made intensive and interestingly very detailed suggestions early on in this overall process that started early last year. So we expect a discussion on some of the details, and I'll come to the critical points in a minute. And there were already, to my knowledge, 2 debates taking place in the Parliament, one in early September about the general line of thinking along the parties that are represented in the Parliament. And in general, the proposal by the Commission was welcomed. And of course, some details are not yet clear whether the Parliament will follow or will ask probably for more. And so the general interest seems to be that the scope and possibilities of the CBAM should be brought forward, not anticipating the resistance or the trade-induced retaliatory risk could be triggered by the CBAM, but rather looking into how to bring forward the proposal, because this is a key part of reforming the European emissions trading scheme. And the Commission itself left open some particular point. They were pretty imprecise, most probably on purpose in order to get some room to maneuver for the legislators, which is not only the Parliament, but also the member states represented in the European Council. There are, of course, specific trade partners affected by the proposal, and that is going to have an impact also on the debates that we expect. First of all, I expect that there will be a fast process, because when you look into what the EU is aiming at, the legislation has to be implemented very quickly. So I think the next year will be a very intensive year, and the CBAM will be part of this fast track. While it's not a formal fast track, but there's the so-called trilogue between the Commission, the Parliament, and the member states that could enable a fast decision-making. Then, of course, there is a claim that in the preamble of the proposal, when it comes to countries to cooperate with, that dialogue with third countries should be continued. I did not come across any systematic or strategic dialogue framing yet, and I think this is not existing because there is a lead by Frans Timmermans, who is the Vice President of the European Commission, who is actually the chief person who takes care of the Fit for 55 package. And also then the preamble of the proposal, it says that it's the possibilities for concluding agreements with other countries should be explored. So I think there is some anticipation that talks with trade partners are part of this process. But after all, the question to what extent input from EU trade partners may influence the final shape of the CBAM legislation, I'm rather skeptical, because I think what I take from the proposal and what is clearly part of the overall Fit for 55 package is that the EU has to find new ways to compensate and to to take care of the risk of carbon leakage. And that's probably my last point, looking at the time, and we can discuss details later. I said that the idea is to get rid of free allowances is very dominant in the debates, and that the CBAM is supposed to be a substitute for taking care of the leakage risk that industry face with an ever-rising carbon price in the EU. So with respect to trade relations, it sticks out that free allocation and import charge could come up in parallel. That's risky, at least legally. And special and differential treatment is not part of the proposal yet for poor countries. And of course, there is at the moment no clear message around how revenues could be also recycled for climate purposes or as part of the climate finance that is part of international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Susanna. I've been taking notes very carefully because there are some really interesting sort of points here about where there might be flexibility and where the, you know, where the proposal already seems to be a bit firm. That would be interesting to come back to. But just to make sure we get all the kind of the initial views on the table, perhaps Arunava, I'll turn to you next for a sense of how the larger export-oriented developing countries, India in particular, if you feel comfortable talking about the Indian kind of reaction, but how broadly kind of some of the larger developing countries are viewing the CBAM and what some of the reactions have been so far.
Sure, Alison. Many thanks for having me here. Also, as just like Susanna said, if you could give me a signal in case I'm overshooting my time limit. Let me just divide up my remarks in three parts. You know, what is the expected sort of instinctive response? What could be an institutional response, and then what could be a potential realpolitik response? What's the instinctive response? And I should, of course, caveat, I don't speak for the Indian government. I run an independent think tank. But what's the instinctive response to a move such as the CBAM? It would be very much in line of what Indian officials have said for more than a decade, that you know, these are unilateral measures and they violate, you know, the core principles of free trade, especially the principles on which the WTO has been built, and that this is going to be illegitimate. As a former environment minister said last year at a CBAM related consultation I had organized, say it would be another CDM, a confidence destroying measure. Now, more specifically, what would this impact? You know, for a country like India, and the EU is the third largest trading partner for India. There's about $75 billion worth of trade between the two. Of course, it could be much larger. India itself exports about $40-odd billion worth of exports to the EU. But it's really the you know, heavy, high carbon emitting sectors such as aluminium, steel, cement, etc., that gets impacted. So at least by the latest UNCTAD analysis, it looks like about $3 billion is what's going to be impacted for India. Now, when I think of a $3 trillion economy, maybe that does not seem that big. So I think, Alice, the response to your question would be that other more trade exposed or more export dependent countries, especially that are exporting more you know, heavy industrial products, etc., to the EU, might be more worried. In fact, one of the sectors, such as cement, of course, it's not traded as much. The Indian cement sector is the world's most energy efficient. So in fact, it could claim that it will in turn impose carbon border tariffs against, you know, EU imports into India. Well, but that's just speculative. That's just sort of the instinctive response. And in the remaining 2-3 minutes, what could be more institutional response? Susanna referred to, you know, this need for continued dialogue with third parties, right? And beyond the sort of trialogue within the European system. But which forum? Will it be through the WTO? Will it be through bilateral consultation? Will it be through the UNFCCC? It's because we don't have a clarity on the legitimacy of the forum. We don't have a continuity in the dialogue that is needed. Notwithstanding that, say, India and EU are strategic partners, they are in fact have a long-running clean energy and climate partnership. So I think it's important to have that dialogue on some of the nuts and bolts, the specifics, the measurement challenges, how the EU is planning to deal with that, etc. Finally, my last minute, I would say what is needed is a more realpolitik response. And specifically, we need a deal for development. We don't need a deal just for trade. We don't need a deal just for climate or the carbon cycle and the carbon equation. We need a deal for development. And that is not a license to pollute at all. But what does a deal for development entail? At the heart of it, why is this being imposed in the first place? It's because the carbon space is limited. Why is the carbon space limited? Because the historical polluters have polluted a lot. The latest analysis that my organization has brought out, evaluating every single developed country, we see that since the start of the Kyoto period of 2008, in the last 12 years, developed countries overall, of course the EU is not as bad as the rest, overall have emitted 25 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent over and above what they were allocated. That's 9 years of Indian emissions. So India can say, well, impose tariffs on us 9 years later. First, open up the carbon space for us. Similarly, we talk about net zero. Forget the past, let's talk about the future. Even if India, the modeling that we've done, even if India went to net zero in 2090, and I'm not proposing that date, its cumulative emissions would still be lower than China's, US, or the EU's between the last century and this century. So ultimately, it is the reason this measure is there is not just because of carbon leakage. It is about delivering more action on climate change. If that is the objective function, then are there better ways to deliver more action on climate change than just this? And for that, we will need to look at how the revenues are used. I have some ideas on the movement of institutional finance, and I have some ideas on the co-development of technology and co-ownership of IPRs of green technology. If we can frame a deal for development around those lines, then I think the trade dimension becomes one part of that larger package. Let me stop there for now.
Thanks, Abhinav. Perfectly on time and absolutely fascinating. I was taking notes, and there's a number of things that I'd like to come back to there in picking this deal for development, but also maybe I think one of the key messages there is situating, right, the use of this particular option for border adjustment within the broader frame of climate policies, right, and sort of making trade policy an element of the policy framework, but perhaps not the one that sort of should be driving the thinking. So that's, I think, an important kind of perspective question for us to come back to. But you also talked about forum, right, and the search, I suppose, for a legitimate forum in which to have these kinds of discussions. And that's a perfect segue, because that's exactly the question that we thought we would put to Lu Zhankun. So Lu, you and I have worked at the WTO for many years together, but you've also had a lot of experience kind of in other fora. Coming at this with your experience of international relations, I mean, do you think a discussion about international cooperation on this is possible? And if so, where should we have it?
Yeah, thank you, Alice. Maybe to start with, just already we could see from the previous two speakers is that CBAM itself is like a picture with two sides. So on the one side, that we do see that the EU has some legitimate concerns on carbon leakage and also level playing field, so on and so forth. And of course, behind this much bigger picture of climate change, when we see recently that the climate change ramps up heat, fire, floods worldwide, causing casualties everywhere, developed and developing. So, but on the other hand, as we could see that is that many research papers and also some governments have expressed the views that quite controversially that how the CBAM is designed and how it will be implemented. In particular, as we are doing this WTO forum, is that whether it is WTO consistent and whether it will treat trade tensions and then with major trading partners, and then hence undermining the already bruised multilateral trading system. So the thing here is that this kind of unilateral action, of course, is not very much welcomed in many developing countries, not only in India, but also in China, where I hear that they are very much concerned. Some Chinese scholars call CBAM green separation. similar to some other countries called unfair green trade barriers. And China did say that if, I think it is not China, it's an American think tank, which say that if $100 is levied on per ton of carbon emission, then the sole Chinese steel sector would be subject to $35 billion every year. So there's a big concern here. So come back to the question is that where should we, what forum should we engage to really drive forward the discussion on climate change, including on carbon leakage and also carbon price. I think the EU itself actually says in the initiative for CBAM is that, I quote here, climate change is a global problem that needs global solutions. So I think that really tells where is the best option. For me, this is, of course, CBAM is only a small thing within the whole climate change picture. So I think that for me as a multilateralist believer, I think that we need to go through multilateral forum to drive forward this discussion. I mean, there are plenty of forum we can use. Is the UNFCCC. We can talk about the big picture and the climate change and everything. That, of course, on this, we knew that in the past several years we have been hit by unilateralism by quite some major countries. But now I do see that there's a kind of emerging kind of a momentum for the major players to come back to climate change. So I did see that the US Biden administration is coming back to multilateralism and already expressed their commitment to climate change. I did see that EU constantly leading, China is also participating, India and others. So I think that's we see a moment, probably a moment that we would revigorate the UNFCCC or Paris Climate Change Forum there. But also the WTO as another very important organization should not be away from this. I think Director General Dr. Iwela has already recently said that the best approach, I quote what she said, the best approach would be for us all to all get together and have groups of countries agree on the common approach to carbon pricing. So I think that's what we also should do. Of course, that we do see in WTO members a mindset shift that climate change and many other things are beginning to have a kind of welcome signal for many members, and already we see quite a lot of the trade and environment sustainability structure discussions, plastic pollution, and also the fossil fuel subsidies, so on and so forth. So I think CBAM carbon pricing could also be put into there. So I think that with this kind of multilateral approach, I think it will be much better for us to pursue this dialogue and push things forward instead of unilateral action like CBAM. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. I think those are some really useful ideas about the options before policymakers, about where a discussion might take place and also where kind of the broader context for this kind of a discussion. But I might give my own colleague Aaron the floor next, because he's sort of done a lot of thinking about what that discussion could look at if we were to have one. So perhaps, Aaron, I'll give you the floor next, and I'll promise to be as strict about your 5 minutes as I were with the others.
No favors for being a colleague. Thanks, Alice. So what I'll try to do quickly is, a lot of this ground has been covered already, but talk very briefly about why this is a hot topic right now, what the need is for international consensus, and then very immodestly think about what an illustrative list of the subjects of that international consensus might be. What kinds of principles, what kinds of best management practices might we imagine to be agreed at the international level? First, why is this a hot topic? because border carbon adjustment is integrally linked to climate ambition, and we have an increasing pressure on the world's government to act on climate change as an issue, as we see increasing climate impacts. More than 54% of global emissions have been put under a net zero target communicated to the UNFCCC Secretariat. 63 UNFCCC parties, 7 of which have put it into law. Let me put it in the context of Canada, my home country. We have a rising price of carbon going up to $140 a ton by 2030, enshrined in law. That schedule is enshrined in law. Politically, it's infeasible to imagine that we could do that without some measures to simply prevent that from resulting in deindustrialization as opposed to decarbonization. We need to ensure that those measures actually result in leakage protection. And I've been strong in advocating for Canada to take climate action, to be a leader, as they should under UNFCCC principles. But I have a hard time seeing that taking place without some form of protection. And in that context, border carbon adjustment, as imperfect as it is, and it is wildly imperfect, may be the least worst option available. Why a need for international consensus? But border carbon adjustment, I think it's important to note, is not a single thing. It's more like a decision tree. It can be a very different instrument depending on how it is designed. At a number of junctures during the elaboration of an instrument like this, we face design choices. And choosing one path over another results in a very different final instrument. It can finally be either a tool for environmental protection or a tool of protectionism. And there will always be, we know, national level lobbying for the latter, as there is in trade policy. One way to resist that sort of lobbying and to achieve an environmental instrument is international agreement on principles and best practice in the elaboration and implementation of border carbon adjustment. Again, this is the same as the situation in trade policy, where we have agreement at the international level in the WTO to curb those sort of national protectionist tendencies. What might that consensus look like? Some principles, this is a non-exhaustive illustrative list, and it doesn't, it's just my perspective. But to give you a flavor of the kinds of agreement we might hope to achieve, principles, the primacy of leakage protection. Border carbon adjustment should only be aimed at preventing leakage, not at preserving competitiveness, not at leveraging others to action. Revenue sharing. A significant portion of the revenues from BCA should be either rebated to the affected country governments or affected producers in developing countries. No double protection. Any BCA charges on foreign goods should be adjusted downward to account for any domestic measures like free allocation that shield the covered sectors from a full carbon price. Credit for equivalence. A border carbon adjustment should grant a credit in its adjustment for any carbon price paid in the country of export. And openness. There should be meaningful, timely consultation on all the draft regulations affecting trading partners and full transparency of the regime operation. In terms of best practice, a border carbon adjustment, we could perhaps agree, should only cover those goods that are subject to domestic carbon pricing schemes. Assumptions about greenhouse gas intensity of goods when they show up at the border, if there are default assumptions, should be challengeable by the exporter who could provide actual data that beats those defaults. Exemptions, there should be no national exemptions from BCA based on national policy. No country really has the prerogative to unilaterally judge the adequacy of climate ambition in other countries. Any international, any requests for actual greenhouse gas data should be based on international standards. And ideally, we have a single agreed standard, but something like the GHG protocol or ISO 14064. Mechanisms for appeal. There should be an independent mechanism to appeal any decision or judgment taken under the BCA regime with respect to foreign producers or goods. This is just a suggested list to give you a flavor, but the final takeaways, border carbon adjustment is coming. It's going to have impacts on third country exporters. One way to react is to exercise countries' legitimate WTO rights, but that path is uncertain. It's lengthy, it's legally uncertain, and that we know the dispute settlement mechanism is currently in something of a limbo. Another way to react, and the way on which we're focusing here, is to try to get agreement that will help shape that tool at the national level, such that it is really a tool to protect environment or to foster development. I very much like Arunava's framing, as opposed to a tool of protectionism. I'll leave it there.
Super, Aaron, thank you. I was taking lots of notes, but I'm sure I've missed some of the details there. So I and others in the audience may want you to come back to some of those ideas. That I think has set the stage quite usefully, right? I mean, we have an example of what a BCA might look like. Some areas that are firming up, some areas that may still be sort of open for negotiation internally and externally, and we have a sense of what some of the kind of the broader context of how this particular trade-focused policy instrument might sit, and some of the broader concerns about how it relates to other efforts, broader climate change efforts, and also how it relates to the functioning of the trade system itself. But I thought maybe the best thing to do now is to actually give the panelists a chance to come back in and react to some of the things that they've heard. And because I'm an unoriginal person, I'm going to take them in the same order that they spoke. So Susanna, would you like a couple of minutes just to react to some of the things you've heard? And for the audience, I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A box. So if you'd like to put comments, I can see a couple of comments and questions in there already. So feel free to fill them in as the panelists have this exchange, and then I'll pull in some questions later. So Susanna, reactions to what you've heard?
Sure, thanks. I think there's so many things I could now react on. I try to limit myself. Maybe we could also reflect a bit more on where we stand. And at the moment, we see a lot of discussions between the EU and the US at the highest political level on how to align the plans for limiting emissions, and we see that the two units, EU and US, will set kind of the tone because they're just big economies. And we have a fundamental problem here when it comes also to legal aspects, that while the EU is clearly on the track of carbon pricing, and Aaron has set up a nice list of how agreement internationally could look like, so crediting only for pricing, the US has definitely no pricing in place, and we like to reinvent things in a direction where you can make things equitable, equivalent in terms of measuring how the cost impacts for companies could look like, which is not foreseen in the basic GATT settings, because GATT is departure is from taxing and domestic taxation, indirect taxation, border tax adjustment. So immediately we get into a discussion on what it would be, what we would like to see happening on a principled and well thought through level, while politically we are already in the midst of discussions on how countries could credit their efforts on climate change action. So this is just a reflection on one of the issues we already have entered, and which will reach the WTO, which have reached the WTO already.
Super. No, I think that's a really useful point to have pulled out. So a reaction perhaps from you, Arunava, to some of the ideas Aaron's put on the table, or some of the other sort of the discussion perhaps about how much flexibility we might hope there is in the design features, not just in the EU proposal, but perhaps in others. I think we're all conscious that there are other proposals perhaps in the pipeline from other large developed countries. So perhaps a sense from you about where we take the discussion next.
Yeah, I had a couple of quick thoughts. One was, again, on something that Susanna and Shakun had mentioned about, how do you, can we find the right platforms to have a more continuing dialogue? Because it just seems that, you're aware of it, but it's happening where you have no agency, and yet you're a large trading partner. That could be China, it could be India, it could be Brazil, whoever. I think that demonstrates a little bit of lack of process legitimacy that might create more problems later. The other point I wanted to reflect on was something that, I loved Aaron's list, and at the same time, I was struggling to keep up, taking notes as well. But two things that he mentioned are sort of interesting. One is that, look, this is coming. Now, if I just took that statement at face value, it would seem like a fairly logical statement to say. And at the same time, I wonder, will this just engender a game of chicken, right? Again, in the absence of a continuing dialogue, because the assumption here is the EU is too large a force to, stop what it has started. It will do it, whether we protest in principle or in practice, it's going to happen. So this is coming. But then trading partners might say, well, yeah, if you think you're going to get away with that, we know that the dispute settlement mechanism might take a long time. And yet that is exactly why we will get started on that, just to kind of slow things down and just, make life difficult for everyone. It's not an optimal option, but it is a game of chicken, and a game of chicken is technically a suboptimal option. Related to that, my other comment on Aaron's list is, I like this thing of, no blanket exemption or no blanket kind of proscribing of any particular country, look at it sector by sector or company by company. But I love his reflections on what that would mean in practice in terms of the analytics and the monitoring and verification associated with it.
Super, thanks, Arunabha. And I thought I might just remind those of you watching that if, like me, you struggled to keep up with the list of things that Aaron was proposing, there is actually an article by him that's just been published on IISD's website that you can go and have a quick look at. Just look under COSBY. You'll find it on the website, and that gives you kind of a nice synthetic summary of some of these key ideas that he's presenting today. So a quick pitch for your article, Aaron. Lou, some reflections perhaps on this question of forum. And I might at this point draw in one of the questions that I can see here. And the question is, isn't the problem with a multilateral approach that it will just take too long? I have been working on the fishery subsidies negotiations for more years than I care to acknowledge. We know the multilateral process takes time because there are so many people involved, because there are so many issues and interests at stake. But isn't there still, maybe I'm betraying my multilateralist bent, but isn't there still a good argument for having a discussion in the multilateral context? How do we balance the benefits of that approach with the challenges and the downsides that we know so well?
Well, to put it simply, it's like a player orchestra of Mozart. The thing is that it is a choice of options. I mean, to play really orchestra, you need to have different instruments all together, coordinate them, discussing, practicing, rehearsal, everything, which will take long, okay? But at the end, you have nice Mozart playing and people love it. People buy tickets and come in to enjoy it. The other thing is that, okay, no, I don't want to do it. I just take my drum, I will beat it and play Mozart. That's quick, I will do it and that's it. But who is going to buy it? How that would... What do you think the reaction from the audience, the global community, other members would do towards that? So I think that to put it simple like that, that's first thing. The second thing is that I alluded a little bit, but let me repeat it myself here, is border adjustment, like CBAM, is just one element of the whole climate change picture. So the thing is that if you just pick that out, and then without looking at the broader picture, how our members are going to commit themselves to carbon emissions, how do they commit to carbon neutrality, and who is doing what, and then of course, as Arun has just said, that how do you deal with development issue? And we have a bulk of developing countries who should always be part of the final resolution. So I think that's why I say that multilateral may take longer. It is more complicated, but it is more legitimate than any unilateral action. To conclude, what I want to say is, at least I cannot say for UNCCC, but at least for WTO, we are seeing a kind of multilateralism with a little bit flexible format, if I could say so. So this kind of GSIs, plurilateral, which means like-minded members, hopefully the big guys, China, US, EU, and India, and others, could come together and try to discuss, develop something while keeping the door open for all the other members. So it's not the same kind of long dragging multilateralism consensus building, but it's kind of process which starts from a smaller group and hopefully become multilateral in the final stage. But I think I see more hopes in multilateralism than in previous years. Thank you.
Thanks, Lou. I think that's useful. I mean, I guess I take from it, this idea of kind of multilateralism, but building it with variable geometry kind of along the way, which I guess is what a lot of multilateral work involves anyway. But I wanted to perhaps kind of, in Aaron giving you the chance to come in, pull in one topic that came up very briefly and that's come up in one of the questions, this idea of a global price for carbon. Because I wanted to just be clear about, I mean, if we're talking about multilateralism about what exactly? I mean, a multilateral agreement on a global price for carbon is probably at the very ambitious end of the spectrum. And I think what we're discussing here is probably something, kind of a multilateral discussion, not quite that ambitious and specific, but kind of about the design features, as you've pointed out. So with that little injection, I wanted to give you the floor for some reactions.
Thanks. This is a really good question. Obviously, I think everybody agrees that the first best solution would be a global price for carbon, which would mean you didn't need a border carbon adjustment mechanism. So we all agree on a price for carbon, then there's no risk of leakage. I think we also can all agree that that's a dim prospect anywhere in the near term or in the visualizable future that this would ever take place. And moreover, I think the idea would have to be nuanced by some consideration for the kinds of historical imbalance of responsibility that Aronaba laid out quite clearly. So you don't have a single global price for carbon. That's not how it works. It has also been proposed that we have climate clubs of ambition that make common cause with ambitious climate policies, and that border carbon adjustment can be part of the sort of ring fence around that, not only acting as a protection, but as a lever to penalize non-club members. Similarly, I find that unrealistic. To have a club of that sort, a Nordhaus type club, you need identical policies within it. It's like a customs union. And the idea that you would have identical border carbon adjustment policies within a club, or even climate policies on which those border carbon adjustments are based, I think doesn't take account of the fundamental differences in approach, in history, in economics, in geography, and politics that take place in every country, that give rise to such different climate policy and energy policy in every country in the world. So for me, the second best solution is a search for common principles by which those countries can apply their climate policy, their energy policy, their development policy, and best management practices. At that level, I think we can get international agreement, but not a harmonized approach. I think that's unrealistic and actually unhelpful in terms of the amount of time we would waste trying to get to an unattainable goal.
Super. I think that's kind of a useful clarification, just kind of situating us on the spectrum of options of what we're actually talking about. I'm going to take two questions from the Q&A box, and then I'm going to try and swap and stretch the format of this session very slightly, because I can see that there is a request for an intervention from the EU, and given that we have spent a lot of time already talking about their CBAM, I would like to give them a little bit of time at the end, if I manage to unmute the appropriate person and it works, to give them the chance to respond and to explain some of the thinking behind their proposal towards the end. I'll start though with the first two questions that I have here. And the first one, I guess, might be perhaps, it might perhaps be a question for you, Aaron, and then I think there might be one for you, Susanna. So the question for you, Aaron, is how could potential exemptions for developing countries or LDCs be justified under the famous GATT Article 20? considering perhaps that a contribution to the policy objective pursued by the measure would be required. And I'm asking because I know that you, in a past life, worked at the WTO's appellate body, so you'd be the right person to answer a legal question like that, right? It's the question about exemptions for developing countries, I suppose, from a trade measure like a CBAM. Is that the sort of thing that would logically, that could be justified under Article 20?
So if you're asking me, I should clarify that I have never worked for the WTO. And that actually I'm a fake lawyer. I'm actually an economist. But for me, the more likely route for that kind of an exemption would come under the enabling clause, right? So we have the GATT, or the WTO's enabling clause, which allows for a violation of the principle of discrimination in favor of developing countries, right? And Article 20, you would have to make the argument somehow that the exemption for developing countries was environmentally motivated. And I think that would be, I mean, you could make that argument, and especially based on the kinds of historical realities and legal responsibilities under the UNFCCC that accord between developed and developing countries. You could make the argument, but I don't think it's a very solid argument. And again, I think the enabling clause under the WTO is probably the safer route to try to attain such an exemption.
Super. Well, and apologies for mischaracterizing your CV. I'll read it closer. The other question that we had here, and I think it might be one perhaps for you, Susanna. Is there a possibility, and maybe this is something that's kind of already come up a little bit already, is there a possibility that border carbon taxes, essentially, sort of taxes imposed at the border, could lead to retaliatory measures, right? Is there a possibility that rather than incentivizing further action, they could lead to retaliation and less cooperation rather than more? Is that sort of a possibility you think exists in the universe of policy responses? Is it a realistic one, or do you think the incentives to improve carbon efficiency will be stronger?
Oh, I think that, of course, it very much depends on the overall international climate, political climate, on how countries perceive the CBAM. If there would have been a second Trump period, I think that would be completely different reactions from the US, because we had this kind of national interest as a dominant strategy in the US before. This is no longer the case, and we can see, even though there is no common technical ground on how to agree with the US at the moment on how to credit each other's climate actions, there is no intention to become aggressive at the moment about this topic. So this is possible always. If you want to do that politically, you can fire away, because the legal situation is unclear. We would need more case law on it. We would probably need a dispute here and there, which is not desirable, as a dispute is never nice to have. So the charging at the border as such is a matter of how much climate policy will be aligned across countries and major trade partners. And we are in a phase where this is likely, that there's a willingness to align climate policies and then to credit for each other's efforts. On the other hand, I see more risks in the way how it could be handled once there is a claim that there is too much subsidization of exports from the EU, because there's still free allocation and then protection for imported competing goods in the EU markets. Because basically from the GATT and the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, there's a very short time periods where countries just simply could go ahead and try it. If they don't want to don't have an interest in being cooperative, they can just install some countervailing action and then try to sort it out, and the pressure is mounting up. So that is a long answer to a short question, probably, but I think it very much depends on where we stand in the multilateral arena. At the moment, we're in a very good phase where there's a prospect of more cooperation, also in resolving the situation of the WTO as such.
No, thank you. In fact, it's a theme that's come up. This question of kind of is this the beginning of a new era for international cooperation on some of these questions? I think is actually a theme that's come up in a number of policy discussions I've been in recently, and so I think it's one worth bearing in mind. We do have a few minutes left, and given that so much of this discussion has focused on the EU and its policy proposal, I am going to do my very best to give to ask our EU colleague here to unmute themselves, if I can.
Yes, possibly.
Hello.
Hello.
Go ahead, you have just a few minutes before we close, 2 or 3.
Okay. Thank you for organizing this forum. There's a number. There's a number of elements I would like to say about the carbon border adjustment to explain how it has been designed not to be a protectionist instrument, not to be a discriminatory instrument, and to be even-handed and complying with WTO rules. I think the first element we should say that the carbon border adjustment is about equal carbon pricing. We have a carbon price in the EU, which is the result of the EU ETS, and we intend to increase and to give him more bite. And from there, well, one thing that we're doing is reducing and getting rid of the free allowances. And there is a risk of carbon leakage. And against this risk, the carbon border adjustment is there to ensure that imported goods are subject to the same price as EU produced goods. But it's also there to ensure that there's no double carbon pricing, meaning that if there is a carbon price paid in the country of origin, well, this carbon price is coming to reduce the amount of adjustment at the border, to make sure that imported goods are not treated in a less favorable manner. And it is to be introduced in a progressive manner. And the last element on the design is that this carbon border adjustment is assessed on the actual emissions, meaning that any effort done either by a company or by a country to reduce the emission in the goods that are subject to CBAM would result in a lesser CBAM and possibly even to zero CBAM if the emissions are lower than what they would be in the EU, or to the subject of carbon price that would apply in the EU. On the question of the least developed countries, the CBAM does not target countries. It applies to goods imported in certain sectors. And the studies we've done show that the trade between the EU and least developed countries in these goods is limited. So, and leaving some countries out of the scope of the mechanism or granting them a blanket exemption would cause issues in the long term, as it would give wrong incentives to investing in not so clean technologies in some countries. So we have built a transitional period which leaves trade partner and leaves businesses the time to adjust to CBAM for 3 years. To start with, there will not be an adjustment, but only collecting information on CBAM. And to avoid global dividing line between third countries, the EU will continue to support least developed countries in targeted ways, such as through technical assistance, technology transfer, extensive capacity building, and financial support, with the objective of developing industrial production structures that are compatible with long-term climate objectives. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much indeed. I think that was a very useful synopsis of some of the key points. And I would note, for those of you looking at the public forum's own platform, there's a very useful synopsis of some of these points, explaining them a bit further in the Q&A box, which I think everybody can see. So please use that as an additional reference. And thanks to our EU colleagues for taking the floor. We have just a couple of minutes left. I won't detain you any further, but I did just want to underline, I guess, what I suppose what I've heard over the last almost 60 minutes or so, I am no expert on CBAMs, on border carbon adjustments in general, but I guess I've heard a number of things. I've heard some very strong and I think very cogent arguments for a multilateral discussion about these questions. You know, in addition to unilateral movement forward, if that's what's required. But I've heard some, you know, notwithstanding the length of time it can take, I think a strong arguments for multilateral discussion. I've also heard some points about being clear and being realistic about what multilateral discussion could focus on, right? I think Aaron's points about the design choices facing governments sort of leads us in this direction, right? What kinds of principles might we want to discuss about the policy choices that governments are all going to be facing as they think about how to establish or how to engage with these sorts of measures as climate ambition ramps up. And I think I've heard some really interesting points about the links between this sort of the trade aspects of climate policy and climate ambition and the broader policies that that impact on economic development more generally, right? Alvina's point, I think, about a broader deal for development. What are we talking about overall in terms of climate ambition and climate policy? Where are we going? And how does trade policy and how do trade related policies fit within kind of a broader framework of collective action, which at the end of the day is what this is all about. If it is a global problem, it does require a global solution, albeit perhaps in bits and pieces. And perhaps kind of the very last point, which is one that Susanna ended on and that I thought was a useful one to end on because it is a positive one, is that if we're looking for opportunities for international cooperation and at least thinking and talking about how we do this together, the current environment is probably not a bad one to be working within, right? We know it has certainly been worse. It may be worse in the future, but at the end of the day, if politics is the art of the possible, let's use the moment that we have now to see what is possible. So sincere thanks to all of our speakers and to Aaron who helped me put the session together, and of course to the technical staff for helping it all to happen, and to you all 150 or so of you who've joined. It's wonderful to see this level of interest in this topic, and I hope you found this session as interesting, as instructive as I have too. So please use Aaron's article on our website as a reference, and also the comments from our EU colleagues in the Q&A box. So with that, I wish you a very good afternoon and thank you very much.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.